Hi everyone, and welcome to day 2 of Known. How exciting. Good to see you all here with us, and if you're on the live stream, so amazing that you can be with us too. I'm Lily. I'm going to be hosting your lunchtime talks this week. I am a second year at St. Anne's studying Portuguese and linguistics. Yep, very niche. And following on from where I began yesterday with 3 random facts about me, I've got 3 more. So firstly, I have lots of dietary requirements. Yes, it is a substitute for personality. I also am periodically late to everything. It is a problem. I don't know why, but it happens. And then thirdly, I don't like coffee. I really am not a fan, like controversial opinion. I don't think it even smells nice. Hot chocolate, absolutely all the way. Cup of tea as well, ideal. So yeah, that's a bit of random stuff about me. But on to way more important things. The lineup for today is we're going to be having a talk by the wonderful Kaz Dodds, followed by a Q&A. And just to say, if you need to leave at any point, we know you have like commitments, 2 o'clock commitments, feel free to just slip out. But we will be aiming to finish at 2. Back to the Q&A. We have a really cool, fun Slido vibe thing. So if you want to whip out your phones, take photos, scan, you can send in questions all throughout the talk, and we will be discussing them with Kaz afterwards. It's completely anonymous, so feel free to send in absolutely anything. And just before we get on to the really exciting stuff, unfortunately, coronavirus is still a thing. So for those of you guys in the building, please keep your masks on when you're inside, and at the end, the hosts will guide you out. But without much further ado, Kaz, would you like to come up to the stage? Also, I've noticed I say without much further ado a lot when I'm hosting, but I don't think that's a phrase that I normally say in normal life, but maybe that'll become my tagline, who knows. Wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you.
Could you tell us a bit about yourself and where you're from?
Yeah, sure. So I'm from Edinburgh. I went to university at a prestigious institution in roughly this part of the world, before moving to Glasgow, where I worked for a church briefly, and then I went back to university, actually. Just enjoy being around university. I did a postgrad in international politics and human rights. More recently, I moved to Edinburgh. I do various things with my week. Most of my week is spent with my 2 4-year-olds. I've got twin girls, but I also work at the Scottish Government in a policy role. I am on holiday this week to speak with you about these big questions, so it's one of my kind of favourite things to do. I'm delighted to be here, so that's me.
Awesome. And as you can tell, Kaz has a wonderful Edinburgh accent. And I warned Kaz the other day that I have a really bad habit of trying to copy accents, kind of unintentionally. But we thought maybe we'll just attempt to copy each other's accents very briefly. So Kaz, could you say for me, curly whirly? And I'm going to give an attempt at copying it.
Curly whirly.
Wait, one more time.
Curly whirly.
Curly whirly. I'm just embarrassing myself in front of everyone.
I'm embarrassing myself.
Oh, that was good.
Oh, that was good.
Okay. This is extra embarrassing for me.
You can play at this game.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, can you say curly whirly in my accent?
Curly whirly.
Okay, that was really good.
No R's.
Okay, my goodness, we're not doing this one again. That was embarrassing.
I'm fine with that.
Okay. And a final question before we get on to the talk. We do have ice cream here today. What is your go-to ice cream flavour?
So similarly to my views on scones and jam and cream that you asked me yesterday, depends on the situation. Vanilla, I know, boring, you might say. I just don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's classic, tasty.
You can't go wrong.
No.
Quite versatile.
Exactly.
I like it indeed. So Kaz is talking to us today on what hope is there for our fractured society. I'm very excited, so take it away.
Thanks so much, Lily. Let me try and balance these things as I come over. Good, so this huge question, what hope is there for our fractured society? One good thing about the recent creation or non-creation of the European Super League, wait for it, I think there is a good thing, was that it united Britain, didn't it, in kind of fury against the idea. Prior to this event, it might have been unthinkable that you could find something that you would unite people like Piers Morgan, Bruno Fernandes, Gary Lineker, Boris Johnson, and several European governments. But it did. It united them in absolute fury at the abhorrence of an idea that top clubs leaving their own leagues and forming one that they couldn't be relegated from. It was a stunning display of national unity, wasn't it? And some quality moments on Twitter. I particularly liked one tweet that said, Tottenham joining a European Super League is like Banana Man getting called up as an Avenger. Which is probably quite right. I also like seeing clubs like Mallaig FC saying that they're declining to join, which is just great. It's a very remote part of Scotland, for your information. The unity around that issue, I think, was particularly noticeable because, if we're honest, there isn't much of that kind of unity going around in the UK today. It's not just in our country. A fairly recent survey for the BBC by Ipsos Mori of more than 19,000 people across 27 countries found that a majority of people in all but 2 countries feel that their society is divided. Almost everyone in Serbia, for example, at 93%, 85% of Brits believe Great Britain to be divided. And of course, there has been lots of kind of moments, hasn't there, in the last few years that have kind of lent themselves to that. Referendums like the Brexit one or on Scottish independence. But there's other issues that feel very heated. It feels like there are kind of 2 camps, that often we have a kind of dividing line that separates people on certain issues. How serious COVID is, whether masks are good or bad, or statues, or a number of different things. Open up Twitter or something like that, and you see that, don't you? That society kind of gets divided into these different camps and lines get drawn. Sometimes that division feels kind of amusing, and other times it feels very personal and very painful, particularly in cases of racism, sexism, ableism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. All these sorts of things. Just in the news yesterday was the kind of increase in racial abuse against Asian people since the coronavirus outbreak. And while we see that kind of awful hatred and division in society, there are also powerful movements to try to counter it, aren't there? So it was headline news, that increase in racial abuse. There was right outrage against that. BLM, gender pay gap legislation, evictions from the Labour Party over anti-Semitism. There is a powerful instinct, a kind of fight for justice that shines through in the face of those divisions. I'm sure many of you might view Christianity as something that kind of furthers the divisions, the divides, that kind of makes those fractures worse rather than better. And so what I want to do today is kind of pose the question of where does that drive for justice or for diversity come from? And secondly, think about, well, what does that mean for me as an individual? Where do I stand on it? Because diversity is rightly one of the most cherished values in our culture today, I would say. Our music reflects this, and it has done for generations. For the generation fighting for civil rights, it was Aretha Franklin singing R-E-S-P-E-C-T. A bit later on, John Lennon singing Imagine All the People Living Life as One. For me, as a teen post 9/11, it was Black Eyed Peas singing Where is the Love? Someone can tell me later what the latest hit about equality, diversity, and unity is. There's lots of examples of this in our culture, I think. Universities are rightly keen to kind of broaden the diversity of their teaching staff, or advertising companies want to show you the diversity of people that are interested in their products. Lots of workplaces have mandatory diversity objectives, mine does. And so I wonder, where does this value come from? We hold it so deeply that even posing that question, I think, seems strange. And I don't just mean what kind of songs or books does it come from, but what way of viewing the world gives us the foundation to think that everyone is equal? Because historically and geographically, that's kind of contingent, that view. It's not everywhere. Not every society has come to that conclusion. So I wonder, where does it come from? After all, it's not a view that springs directly from, for example, our biology. It's not something that kind of naturally comes out of a purely naturalistic or materialistic way of viewing the world. Studying science won't take us to human rights, let alone universal human rights. For example, you don't study the human body and next to the heart and the lungs find human rights. The author of best-selling book *Sapiens*, which kind of charts the history of humanity as a species, the author Yuval Noah Harari says on the issue of human rights, there are no such rights in biology. So where does it come from? Well, Yuval Noah Harari is in no doubt. He says it's rooted in Christianity. He sees the Human Rights Project as a kind of hangover from Christianity. Of course, it's an idea which has resonance for many belief systems around the world. Some version of the kind of golden rule is found in lots of different philosophies, isn't it? But historians like Tom Holland make the same point about our current understanding of human rights as being something that is born out of a Christian way of viewing the world. He notes that the start of human rights, as we understand them in that phrase, coined was in the 16th century when a man called Bartolomé de las Casas, I should have asked Lily about the pronunciation of that as a linguist, he argued against Spanish treatment of Native Americans that was brutal and inhumane. And the grounds on which he did that were that every person, Christian or not, had rights that derived from God, humanos derechos, human rights. He argued that the Christian story of a God who created all people in his image, all people, was the kind of glass through which you saw every person as inherently valuable. If we remove anything supernatural from our kind of conception of the universe, if we say that our materiality is the kind of sum total of who we are, then we can't really use words like should or ought. Where does the ought come from? Where does that obligation to treat people in a certain way or with equality, where does that come from? Again, because that idea is so deeply held in our society, it does feel bizarre, I think, to even pose the question. But it is an inherently Christian idea. It's come out of a Christian worldview. That fact makes it all the more damning that Christians have often acted in ways that goes against that. Slavers, abusers, racists have all used Christianity as a means to further their own ends. I think we have to face that. And I'm sorry if you felt that Christians haven't cared for you in a way that is right. And when faced with that kind of contradiction, I think we have to ask, is that because of their beliefs? Or is it in spite of them? And if we take a look at the person who Christians follow, the person of Jesus, we see someone whose commitment to justice and to the vulnerable and to the downcast is completely unquestioned. Those people need more Jesus, not less, I would argue. Jesus, who though he was God, became flesh, God in the flesh, became human. He came to those who were even his enemies. He crossed that dividing line that we like to draw. And he challenged those who enforced it. If you read an account of Jesus' life, like this one, John's Gospel, that the Christian Union are giving out this week, I think you see that. Again and again, you see Jesus bridging divides. If you read it for yourself, you'll see bridging the divide between Jew and Gentile, or male and female, or rich and poor. I want to point briefly, because of time, to a part of this account, which is on page 54. So if you've got these, you might want to pick it up on page 54. And I just want to kind of pick out bits from a story which is really worth reading at length yourself, but that I won't read the whole lot of because of time. I'll kind of just summarize the story and pick out bits of it, which centers on a blind man. And there's an assumption in this society around at the time that rightly we kind of balk at, which is that this person was somehow more sinful than others. Common in the time it was written, and rightly not widely held now. So at the bottom of page 54, the big number 9, we read this: "As he went along, Jesus saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" So we see that kind of assumption. And then Jesus turns that on his head. It's very simply one line: "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," Jesus said. Jesus' listeners love to draw this kind of dividing line between people. Some people who are good, some people who are bad, some people who are valuable, some people who aren't. And Jesus isn't having it. Jesus shows us the God-man who loves all people, who made all people, who gave them dignity and value and worth, who himself became human, became part of the creation, and who gave his own life to those who were considered on the other side of the line. That's why in the early centuries, as Christianity spread, discriminatory practices that were part of a culture at that time decreased. Whether that be infanticide in the Greco-Roman world, or the abolition of slavery in the 19th century, or the civil rights movement in the 20th century. That's why Christianity is the most diverse social movement of all of history. Lamin Sanneh, a man of Gambian origin who was a professor of history at Yale in America, he wrote, "More people pray and worship in more languages in Christianity than in any other religion in the world." That's true of any worldview, actually. Christianity has greater ethnic, linguistic, cultural, socio-economic diversity than any other worldview, whether that be atheism or Buddhism or whatever you like. Because at the heart of Christianity is God in the flesh who extended the golden rule, not just from something that was kind of termed negatively, that which you hate to be done to you, do not do to another, to something positive, love your neighbor as yourself, to something unimaginable, love your enemies. And again, that is so striking as we read through these accounts of Jesus' life, that he does seem to be on the side of those who were perhaps considered the enemy or the outsider, the poor, the marginalized, not just the financially poor, but the spiritually poor, people who might have been very wealthy, but who were kind of cut off as bad people in society, the oppressed. The gospel accounts are just full of these kinds of divisions in society and Jesus bridging them. And that, I think, in our kind of culture is hugely appealing, isn't it? When we see that, and I do invite you to take a look at these for yourselves, that is hugely appealing to us. I think we sort of approve of Jesus for that. Like he passes our test of what is good, rather than perhaps realizing that we've basically inherited his. We see ourselves as inclusive, don't we, as loving. The divisive, tricky people, they're out there, and they're the problem. And so as we look at kind of the next little bit in this account in chapter 9, I just want to ask the question, what does that mean for us? Are we genuinely as inclusive as we make out? Are we as inclusive as Jesus here? So I just want to pick up the story over on page 56 of these John's Gospels and at the little number 6. And reading that sentence, little 6, the next part of the story, after Jesus challenges these people, he says, after saying this, he spat on the ground, made some mud with the saliva and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. Mixed in among what is, very pedestrian kind of reporting details, like the name of the pool, is an account of the miraculous. A man who was blind now seeing. And much like the account that we looked at yesterday, if you're at the events yesterday, there follows a huge amount of skepticism, which is what you would expect, isn't it? This account is full of skeptics. The first group to disbelieve are the chap's neighbours. It seems like, this is down in verses 8 and 9, I won't read them out, but it seems like they were enjoying having someone who they could look down on, the kind of local nobody that they wanted to kind of keep in their place. And the second group are the Pharisees, religious leaders in verse 13, who are angry about the healing because it happened on the Sabbath. They considered that a breach of the law. And they refused to believe that Jesus could be carrying out these incredible saving acts towards people who were known as sinners. And so at the bottom of page 58, we see how the Pharisees kind of respond to this situation. They just completely ignore the man's testimony that Jesus has intervened in his life. So at the bottom of page 58 and the number 34, it'll be on the screens. To this, the Pharisees replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. They just silenced this guy. Don't give him a voice. Dismiss the idea that Jesus could be the one who healed him, because this man is simply beyond the pale, steeped in sin at birth. They don't give him a hearing. His views are so abhorrent that they won't even listen to him. And I wonder whether or not there is something of that in us, actually. Not with this particular example, but perhaps with a different group where we think, well, I can't even listen to that. I don't even want to engage with that. They are so beyond the pale that I don't want to know what they're saying. I wonder who it could be for you. Climate deniers, COVID deniers, white supremacists, Brexiteers. Is there people who you feel, well, they're beyond the pale? And as uncomfortable as it sounds, I think, if we're honest, there is something of that kind of Pharisee in all of us. I think we tend to look at the world as those that are essentially good and those that are essentially bad. I think lots of us do that naturally. And we tend to put ourselves in the good camp. Even when we do things that we know are wrong, we kind of excuse it, don't we? By saying, well, I was tired, or I was pressurized, or I was drunk, or whatever it was. We don't judge other people like that. If we see someone else speeding, then we're quick to kind of say how ridiculous it is and how terrible it is. But if we're speeding, then we think, well, I had to because I was going to be late. Author Stephen Covey sums this attitude up well, I think. He says, we judge ourselves by our intentions and others by their behaviors. That's right, isn't it? We judge ourselves by our intentions and others by our behaviors. That isn't fair. One person who had lots of reason for blaming others for any of his mistakes was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was imprisoned in a gulag in Soviet Russia, suffered under the cruelest conditions. And to this idea that we could draw a line between the good and the bad, he responds, the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. He's suggesting that though undoubtedly everyone bears huge value, dignity, beauty, goodness, that we're also all broken. We all have a tendency to think of ourselves first. We all need forgiveness in one sense or another. As the Bible kind of calls out that attitude of thinking, well, I'm good, but they're not, as self-righteousness. And so at the end of this particular little section of John's account, where the refusal of the Pharisees to see that this man, this outsider, could be healed by Jesus is challenged by him, and that Jesus could be the Son of God with the authority to do that sort of thing, Jesus leaves them with a really unsettling conundrum that I think should unsettle us too. To their refusal to admit that this man had been healed by Jesus, he says, and this is over on page 60, and this is where our little kind of accelerated run through this story will end. He says to this group, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin, but now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. Now that you claim you can see. Now that you claim, I'm in the right, they're in the wrong, I'm inclusive, they're divisive, that you don't see that we're all in the same boat, that we are all in need of being healed by Jesus. We're all in need of being forgiven. This man and the Pharisees were both spiritually in need of Jesus' healing, but only one of them knew it. Only one of them listened. The Christian message is, the world isn't divided between good and bad. We're all in this mess together. And realizing that, I think, will bring healing and peace. That's the kind of grace that turns people like this man, I've got a picture of him, Tom Tarrants, who was a racist Ku Klux Klan member who was arrested eventually for planting a bomb in a Jewish leader's house, turns him from a racist who looked at huge parts of the world full of people who he thought were less, who were nothing, into advocates for racial equality. And it also frees those who've been victims of awful trauma to forgive their abusers. An image of the last century of some of the kind of horrible divisions that we see and the outworking of that. One image that's very well known is of a little girl in Vietnam running from a napalm bomb. And that little girl, who we probably know better as a little girl rather than as a woman, which she is now, Phan Thi Kim Phuc, she talks of her bitterness towards those who hurt her before becoming a Christian and the forgiveness that she experienced that then allowed her to forgive others. She writes this, which I think is really powerful. She writes, "I had to deal with the pain every day. It built me up with hatred, bitterness, and anger. I was living with the question, why me? And eventually I became a Christian. And since I have faith, my enemies list became my prayer list. I realized that forgiveness set my heart free. I forgive everyone who caused my suffering." Now, I can't even begin to imagine how someone would have the resources of kindness, the resources of forgiveness to be able to do that, to forgive someone who dropped that bomb. And yet this woman says that those resources are found in Jesus. This is where I want to finish because I want to hear your questions and have a bit of discussion. But I want to leave with that thought. Isn't that the kind of healing that our world needs? Well, let me finish there and I'll invite Lily back up and we'll see what questions people have. Thanks, Lily. Over to you.
Brill, thank you so much. I thought that was really insightful, and I was really challenged by some of those points as well, and just struck by how timeless Jesus was as a figure. Actually, I think that's incredible. So we have some questions for you.
Okay.
Sorry. Should have got this up first. Okay. You mentioned how Jesus bridges the gaps between the divides in this world. I was wondering how you would say Jesus helps to bridge the divides inside of us as well, e.g. doubts, self-doubts, good versus bad thoughts, the critical and unmerciful voice versus self-care.
Yeah, really interesting question, because this is very much kind of focused on, I suppose, societal divisions rather than a kind of personal experience of Christianity and the difference that it makes to an individual. To give a little pitch, I will be speaking more about that tomorrow. So the title is, What Will It Take to Feel Connected? So come back if that's your question. To give a little headline, I think the kind of key thing that the way that we view ourselves, the difference that Christianity makes, is that it helps me to see myself as I really am. So sometimes when I speak about this idea of Christianity kind of exposing all of us as being self-righteous, for example, all of us as needing forgiven, of needing healed, it can sound like, gosh, that's really down on yourself. Like, should we not kind of, see the good in us, kind of love ourselves, all that sort of thing? And I think there's lots of truth in that, but I think the most kind of freeing, redeeming thing is not necessarily to think well of myself, but to think of myself as how I really am, to really truly see myself. That's what's redeeming and freeing. And sometimes I think, reading these accounts of Jesus' life in particular, I've found that that's a bit like a mirror held up against me, that something that is seemingly so distant in terms of culture and time and all the rest of it, actually really powerfully pinpoints things about myself. Yes, that is uncomfortable. And there is something that will always kind of be, as I see the person of Jesus, there will always be something when I look at that I think I am so far from that. But that isn't a condemning thing, but a freeing thing, because Jesus doesn't leave me there. Instead, he extends his grace and his kindness towards me, adopts me as a child of God because of his death and resurrection. And so, I don't think that leaves us feeling like we've got these two parts of us, one side that doesn't like ourselves, one side that does. No, I think that's just seeing a kind of integrated whole person. and that there is real freedom in seeing not just what do I want to be like, but what am I like. That to me has been kind of a very freeing thing rather than something that's kind of promoted a division within me. There's more to be said on that. Come back tomorrow.
There's a good plug. Another one. You talked about empathizing with the other side, so people we might be quick to reject. Do you think that the practice of cancel culture, which is present nowadays, is harmful to this mentality?
An interesting question. Cancel culture. Yeah, I mean, cancel culture. That in itself is something that, we can use to kind of create different camps with, can't we? So even the discussion of cancel culture is, I think, quite heated because it kind of, I think, can make us that we can be quick to put people in certain camps of like, oh, right, well, that person won't listen to another point of view, or well, that person thinks it's okay to say all sorts of outrageous things, just because they've got the right to say that. So even the discussion of that, I think, is quite heated, which tells us a lot about where we are as a kind of culture. On the whole, I think probably my view is that, the idea that we shouldn't listen to people's views when we disagree with them as a kind of premise, which is not always what people who are cancelled are doing. I think sometimes there are legitimate situations where you'll say it's actually unhelpful to kind of give a particular platform at a particular time, at a particular place to this person. But that kind of general principle of we shouldn't engage with those views because we disagree with them, I think is not good. And I don't think speaks of a kind of a way of viewing the world that says that everyone is valuable, that everyone should have the right to be heard and to say things that are important to them, various different rights. I think it's quite interesting at the moment. I was reflecting this recently when Richard Dawkins, well-known atheist, had a kind of an award stripped from him. It's like, I mean, I'm sure he's not too worried. He's a pretty successful man, isn't he? But there was a kind of humanist award that was given to him in the 90s, and it was taken away because I think he kind of spoke into issues of biological sex and trans rights. And it was really interesting to me that he was kind of, what was said in the news, that he was no platformed or cancelled because of that view. It was just striking to me because as a Christian who disagrees with lots of what Richard Dawkins has said, it's probably actually events run by Christians where I've most heard his voice, which I think is just an interesting commentary. I don't think Christians have always been good at holding up kind of voices that are different or whatever, but it's just interesting that he wasn't cancelled by Christians. Actually, most of the times I've heard him speak, it's when Christians have been wanting to engage with his ideas, I suppose, in order, yes, to disagree with them, but in order to kind of take them seriously as well, which I think is interesting. Obviously, there was the time my granny bought me the tickets that I mentioned yesterday as well. That was coming from quite a different perspective, but I think they're just kind of interesting observations, aren't they?
Yeah, brilliant. We've got some really wonderful questions here. Do we want to open up to the floor as well? If any of you guys have any questions that you want to sort of raise your hand and shout out now, then feel free, because it's good to engage. If you've sent in a question to the Slido and want to own your question, go ahead as well. If not, we can continue with the Slido questions. No. Perfect. Well, that makes the job easier. Brilliant question here. How do we combine the need for healing with the need for justice? And how do we ensure forgiveness for abusers doesn't amount to them getting away with it?
Yeah. Great question. How do we kind of keep both the healing and the justice and ensure that forgiveness doesn't mean that people get let off type thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is hugely important, and I think I felt very aware of that as I was kind of preparing thoughts on this subject, that I absolutely don't want to be heard to say that injustice doesn't matter, and that somehow because of the forgiveness that Jesus offers, that it means that injustices somehow don't matter, or somehow don't get, just get swept under the carpet. I don't think that that's what the Christian message says. And particularly because if you look at the way that our injustice was ultimately dealt with, that what Christians believe is that all of our wrongdoing, whether it be something that seems small to us or something that is hugely damaging and has done awful damage, that the death of Jesus was big enough to cover, to provide forgiveness for all of that. Now, that is enormous. The Son of God, the God who became flesh in order to bring people back to God, dying on our behalf. And I think in that moment, in the Son of God being crucified, you see both of that. You see the kind of ultimate compassion and love and forgiveness, but you also see ultimate justice. That the God that Jesus shows us isn't one who just says, well, we just have to be nice. We just have to be kind. Don't worry if people are horrible. Justice isn't, all that important. Let's just be nice. No, justice needs to be done. And the awful things that have happened in human history, there is a weight to those. There is an accountability to those. Justice matters. And that is why that ultimate cosmic event, the Son of God dying on a cross, that huge cost that was paid, shows both the commitment to love and to healing, to forgiveness, but also to justice. And that we will be accountable as well in the future. It's interesting, I think, in our culture, that the idea of a kind of future judgment, the idea that there would be a God who will judge in the future, is like pretty, we kind of like, we find that idea a bit kind of repellent, the idea of judgment. I wonder if that's born out of a kind of a society that hasn't necessarily seen kind of like awful, public displays of injustice, or for example, living through kind of some of the atrocities, for example, in other parts of the world in recent history, and where the idea of a future judgment is a good thing. People long for that kind of justice to be done. It feels like, why can't that come sooner? Which I think is quite interesting. So I would say that uniquely the Christian message both kind of offers that love, that healing, that forgiveness, and that peace, but also justice. And that we then, as people seeking to follow Jesus, would want to embody both of those things as well. That we would absolutely want to offer, that we would want to pursue justice, that we should fight for that will sometimes seem quite kind of brutal, that fight for justice, and that we can be totally freed by the forgiveness that Jesus offers. I'll leave it there, because I could keep talking about that.
We're gonna do one more. We've been having amazing questions. Thank you so much, guys. We've got one more, which is, how do we get to a society where everyone is like Jesus? Or will we ever get there? And I guess kind of linked in, what could I, as a university student, do to pursue this unity instead of fracture?
Yeah, good question. I think the first thing to say is, I do think that Jesus is the kind of example for us to follow. Like if we were all, a lot more like Jesus, that would be great. But I don't want you to go away from today thinking that what I have said, the core message of Christianity is be like Jesus. Because Jesus didn't just come as the kind of model of humanity, that kind of beautiful humanity of how we were made to be. Not just that. He came because we are not that. And so when I look at the person of Jesus, I both see something of what I want to be like, but also the absolute recognition of what I'm not, which is why the heart of the Christian message is Jesus' death on my behalf. And yes, then as a Christian, I want to seek to be more and more like him day by day, because I believe that my rebellion, all of my kind of self-righteousness has been forgiven by Jesus. I can start to grow. But yeah, I do want to be more like him. And so if you want to be more like him, then I would say the first thing to do is to, as he says at the start of another account of Jesus' life, repent and believe the good news. Say sorry to God that you've been so self-righteous, want to do things your own way, wants to think that you're right and everyone else is wrong. Say sorry to God, and then seek to follow Jesus in all that you do. That I think, rather than kind of looking at Jesus as another example of a good person that we should try to be like, that there's more to the Christian message than that. So if we want to be more like him, then that's, I think, the way into that. really good way to do that is just to open up the Bible for yourself. So if you're not someone who's read the Bible as kind of thinking adult, then I would really encourage you to do that. There's lots of opportunities to do that this week by coming back to, for example, the events in the evenings as well, to get more opportunity to kind of explore that. So I warmly invite you to those.
Thank you so much. Sorry if your question didn't get answered, but Kaz will be around after this talk, and so will other people of the Known team who are helpfully wearing Known jumpers and lanyards. And please do, in a socially distant manner, grab them and have a chat and ask these questions, and maybe chat to the people you came with, just anything that interested you. Keep those discussions open.
I'd love that. I'd really love to have those discussions. So yeah, don't be afraid to come say hi.
Awesome. And further to that, Known is continuing all week, like Kaz said, with some talk topics, which I wrote down this time because I forgot them yesterday when I tried to say them. So tonight we have Imagine a World Where No One Was Excluded. And tomorrow, lunchtime as well, we have What Would It Take to Feel Connected? So some really interesting topics, so do be sure to check those out. And even more excitingly, potentially, Known continues on beyond this week with an event that OICCU runs called The Search, which happens every Monday and Tuesday, and you're about to get a promo video for that. Brill. That looks so great. And so The Search, like I mentioned, happening every Monday and Tuesday in person and online. So double whammy, everyone can come. And currently it's taking place in people's gardens with hot chocolates, marshmallows, fire pits. I mean, can you imagine a dreamier setup? And it starts with a short talk, and then you have an entire hour to discuss these life questions. So I'd really encourage you to get involved. And in fact, getting involved is super easy. All you have to do is text SEARCH to 88802 to receive specific updates every week on what's coming up. So go for it, basically. I'll give you an opportunity to do that now. Why not? You never know. Something might just really interest you one week, and you're not going to lose anything from doing that. And so while you're just doing that, just also a thank you to the team and the amazing people who have done so much work behind the scenes. You guys are incredible. That brings us to the end of our lunchtime event. When you leave, please stay in your seats until the stewards tell you can go. But it's been wonderful to see you, and do chat to people and keep those discussions open. And if you're on the live stream, perhaps have a Zoom call with some friends if you're not already on one now. Hope to see you again soon. Oh, and enjoy the free G&Ds.